Problem of the day number 18. Now let's look at a proof involving parallel lines. So in this example, we're given that AD is parallel to BC and angle 1 is congruent to angle C. Okay, so let's start off by marking our picture. So in case you forgot, parallel is marked by arrows facing in the same direction with the same number of marks. Okay, so that's how we would mark that AD is parallel to BC. And we also know that angle 1 is congruent to angle C. So angles that are congruent are marked with the same number of arcs. Okay, and what we want to prove is that triangle ABC, which is this triangle here, is isosceles, okay? And they give us a hint that we're not trying to prove congruent triangles, okay? That's not the goal of the proof. We just want to prove that the triangle is isosceles. Now, in case you forgot, isosceles means that it's a triangle with two congruent sides. And kind of a side note of that is that if two sides of a triangle are congruent, that means that the angles opposite those congruent sides are also going to be congruent. So that's kind of giving us an idea of where we want to, how we want to prove this. Okay, so we want to prove that the triangle is congruent, but they haven't given us any sides. So there's no way for us to prove that the sides are congruent unless we prove that two of the angles are congruent. Okay. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for two congruent angles. So we kind of look at this hint that angle 1 and angle C are congruent. So if we can find an angle that's congruent to angle 1 or angle C, then we can prove that two of the sides are congruent, which means that that the triangle is isosceles. So for example, angle 1 and angle B are going to be congruent because they're corresponding angles, because they're both to the right of the transversal. So this would be the transversal, and they're both above the two parallel lines. So that means that they're in the same corresponding positions to the lines. And so if the lines are parallel, then the corresponding angles are going to be congruent. And so that means that angle B and angle C are also going to be congruent, which means that the sides opposite them, so across from angle C is the side AB and across from angle B is the side AC, those two sides are also going to be congruent, which tells you that the triangle is isosceles. Okay, so that's kind of our plan of action, and let's go through and fill in all the steps. So because we know that the lines AD is parallel to BC, we know that the corresponding angles are going to be congruent. So angle 1 is going to be congruent to angle B. So angle 1 is congruent to angle B. And the reason for that is because if the lines are parallel, then we know that the corresponding angles are congruent. Corresponding angles are congruent. Okay, and then that's basically all we want to say about this one. Okay, then let's look at the second given because they give us a hint that we want to use our next given. So we know that angle 1 is congruent to angle C. So angle 1 is congruent to angle C, and that's given. So angle 1 already has 1 mark, so I'm going to also mark angle C with 1 mark. And that also gives us a hint of what our next step should be, which is that because angle B and angle C both have 1 mark, they're also going to be congruent to each other by the transitive property. Okay, so that means that angle B is also going to be congruent to angle C by the transitive property. Okay, and the transitive property is just saying, okay, if you have something like angle 1 is congruent to angle B, but angle 1 is also congruent to something else like angle C, then those two things that angle 1 is congruent to are going to be congruent to each other. That's what transitive property is really saying. Okay, and so now we know that angle B is congruent to angle C, which means that because they're in a triangle, that means that the sides opposite them are also going to be congruent. So opposite of angle B is going to be side AC. So we know that AC, that side, is going to be congruent to the side opposite angle C, which is going to be AB. So it's congruent to side AB. Okay, and the reason for that is because if two angles of a triangle are congruent, then sides opposite them, are also going to be congruent. Okay, so we know that AC is congruent to AB. All right, and so that tells us the triangle ABC is going to be isosceles because that's the definition of an isosceles triangle. It's a triangle with two sides that are congruent. So definition of isosceles triangle. Okay, some people might write the reverse definition. Okay, because the definition goes, if a triangle is isosceles, then two sides are congruent. But the reverse would just be, if two sides of a triangle are congruent, then it's isosceles. But because it's a definition, it goes both ways, and it doesn't really matter if we're talking about one way or the other. So the other way you could write that is two congruent sides implies isosceles triangle. Okay, either way you write that would be fine.